The sky was about to break when a rooster crowed in the village, but that startled sound quickly faded into the mournful, suffocating air. The scenery of Kui village was still shrouded in a murky white mist, every object looking eerie, like a spirit's tomb. Most people were still asleep, yet in the vast, pristine brick courtyard of Master Keem's house, all the servants were already gathered. 8 loyal servants, dressed in dark clothes, walked barefoot to form a solemn circle, exchanging glances filled with surprise and fear. A bundle of burning torches cast a dim, red light, illuminating a wretched sight. In the middle of the circle lay a person, clothes disheveled, face swollen from a beating. Scattered around the bloodied body were countless silver coins. This was none other than Dan, the rogue, who had just turned 20 this year. He had worked as a servant in Master Keem's family for a year, proving himself a diligent and hardworking man, much to the satisfaction of his masters. On the 3-tiered silver platform, Master Keem paced back and forth, his face grim with anger, the rattan whip in his hand swaying with each movement. From inside the house, a faint, pleading voice drifted out. "Stop, Keem. If you keep beating him, he'll die. You'll commit a sin." Turning to look inside, Master Keem helped his frail, elderly mother out. Grandma Nham, Master Keem's mother, was nearly 80 this year and had been ill for months, rarely leaving her bed. Yet she had forced herself up her steps heavy to come out. Master Keem was startled, quickly dropping the whip. He hurried to support his mother, saying gently, "Mother, come in. It's still very dark. Come inside so you don't catch a cold." Grandma Nham, still leaning on her son's arm, spoke firmly, "If I don't stop you, who can rein in your temper? Why did you beat him so badly, turning him into such a wreck?" After asking, Grandma Nham coughed weakly a few times. As his mother brought up the old matter, Master Keem's anger flared again. He walked straight into the courtyard, pointing at Dan, who lay in a pool of blood, his face dark and bruised. "Look at this rogue. He took advantage of the dark night to sneak into the house and steal. My son and Tai caught him red-handed. And how come the money in the house has been depleting so much lately? It seems we have a traitor living amongst us." Grandma Nham closed her eyes, then whispered, "Why are you so foolish, child? Is there nothing to fear? Couldn't you have just asked your masters? Why resort to stealing?" Seeing her son still fuming, Grandma Nham wearily urged, "Keem, just let it go. 10 beatings are enough, just give him a chance to live." Master Keem resolutely declared, "Mother, I have always obeyed your every word, but this time I must disagree. This kind of ungrateful thief must be severely punished. Do you remember, Mother? The day I returned from the capital, he was lying half dead by the roadside, gravely ill. I took pity on him, brought him into our home, made him a servant, fed him 2 meals a day, and paid him 8 kwon a year. Tell me, Mother, which household treats its servants better than we do? Yet I never imagined he would betray me." He finished with a decisive flick of his robe, entering the house. "If we don't punish this kind of person severely, one day he'll break into our house and harm the whole family." After a few seconds of silence, Master Keem narrowed his eyes and commanded, "You there, tie up this scoundrel and take him to the village constable for legal judgment." The servants in the house quickly obeyed Master Keem's command. Seeing her son's resolve, Grandma Nham was now truly panicked. "Keem, no. If you hand him over to the village constable, it will be a big mess, a huge trouble. The village has become very strict lately. Thieves have their hands cut off and adulterers are exiled. Please, consider it as a blessing if you forgive one person, Keem." Master Keem didn't want to follow his mother's advice. He was a learned and wise man, always thoughtful, and treated his servants like family. Dan, too, was diligent and did everything to his liking, so Master Keem genuinely liked him. However, being an upright man, he despised ungrateful thieves the most. Moreover, the evidence was clear as day. If he didn't act strictly to deter others, it would set a bad precedent. He knew that if Dan were handed over to the village constable, he would surely have his hand cut off and be imprisoned. Master Keem couldn't bring himself to do that, but fortunately his mother's pleas acted as a saving grace. Still, he glared, his voice stern, "Consider yourself lucky, thanks to Mother's compassionate heart. Today I'm letting you go. Now get out of this house. Don't let me see your face again. Let others learn from this. If there's a next time, don't blame me for being heartless." Seeing her son yield, Grandma Nham wearily stepped forward. She motioned to Sen, the servant girl, and whispered, "Sen, put these silver coins into a pouch for him." Then Grandma Nham gently helped Dan up and said, "You foolish child. To covet fame is costly, to sell your name is shameful. Consider today's beating a lesson. From now on, live honestly. Don't let a small profit blind you and lead you to your death. Dan, weak, knelt and clasped his hands, bowing to Grandma Nham as if she were a deity. Seeing that he had taken the silver coins Sen had given him, Grandma Nham reached into her own purse, pulled out a few more quan, and secretly gave them to Dan, saying, "You worked for the old lady. Even if you had nothing to eat, you still had a place to stay. No one in this house was ever cruel to you, but you committed a great sin. Take these silver coins and money as payment for your past service. Take them and go find a livelihood elsewhere. But promise me never steal again." Dan received the silver coins and money, then weakly rose, trudged away, and disappeared. The white mist still lingered, quickly swallowing his faint figure. Master Keem, leaning on the wooden fence, sighed heavily, worn out. Grandma Nham, weak, leaned on her daughter-in-law's arm and returned to her room. Master Keem, exhausted, waved away the other servants, who then dispersed. Alone, he walked to the veranda, lost in thought, pondering the ways of the world. A little more about Master Keem's family. Master Keem's ancestors had lived in this village for 7 generations. His family was extremely wealthy, owning vast rice fields and property, with wealth accumulated over generations. Master Keem was also a shrewd businessman, so his family's assets were said to be hundreds of times larger than any other. Despite living in such luxury, Master Keem never looked down on others, unlike most new rich in the village. Not only with his wife, children, and servants, but also with the villagers, Master Keem was always extremely thoughtful. With so much money, Master Keem generously donated rice and money to help the village through the great flood of the goat year. When the lean season brought hunger, it was Master Keem who ordered the distribution of rice and spent a large sum to build a village school, even hiring a renowned scholar from a neighboring district to teach the children. Thus, his family was highly respected in the village, considered living Buddhas. Even the village elders and officials held Master Keem in the highest esteem. Master Keem was a good-natured and kind man, but the villagers would say they owed Grandma Nham 100 times more. She was a gentle, virtuous woman who had been a vegetarian for decades. In her youth, Grandma Nham was a skilled healer who had saved countless lives without ever asking for a single coin. Not just adults, even the children in the village loved her and called her Grandma of the village. Thanks to the blessings of Grandma Nham's family, in recent years, the village had transformed. Hundreds of dilapidated thatched houses were replaced, and the villagers' lives improved. Children received pens and ink to study, and the communal fields now had buffaloes for plowing. Every family raised chickens that laid eggs. Thus, many talents emerged in the village. The twin scourges of hunger and illiteracy were largely pushed back. More than half the men in the village gave up their drunken, debauched ways, bringing joy to everyone. With improved living standards, however, village laws became extremely strict. Theft was now considered a grave crime. Returning to that day, after a while, the morning sun began to peek through. The white mist gradually dissipated. Kui village quietly burst into life. The crowing of roosters, the barking of dogs, the calls of people working the fields, shouting to neighbors, a dozen sounds interwoven, bringing vitality to a long, arduous day. By the time Master Keem went into the inner house, he quickly turned around to leave again. His wife, Mrs. Ba Keem, hurried forward and asked, "Where are you going so early, husband? Haven't you had breakfast yet?" "I told Sen to prepare a meal to take to the village elder's house to discuss the water irrigation. A few nights ago, I consulted the almanac, and it predicts a major storm this year. If our village doesn't reinforce the dikes, the disaster of the goat year will return. You and the children eat first. I've had my medicine and rested. I don't know how long I'll be gone." Master Keem resolutely grabbed his staff and left immediately. Mrs. Ba Keem smiled wistfully as she watched him go, then headed to the kitchen, urging Sen to prepare breakfast. As for Dan, after suffering a near-fatal beating and being chased out of the village, he went to a small house on the dike of Nhat Lai village, where an old friend lived. He asked for lodging while he searched for a new livelihood. To call him a friend was an overstatement. Tai was actually a gambler and a notorious thief Dan knew from their darker days. Tai, who was a year older than Dan and also a poor commoner, was sitting cross-legged, sipping tea, when Dan staggered towards him, looking utterly wretched. Tai immediately stood up. Where have you been, wandering about so early in the morning looking like this? Who beat you so badly? Dan slumped onto the ground, looking at his friend. Who could beat me? It was that Master Keem. I went to his house late at night, thinking no one would see me. I've done it successfully 8 times before, but this time I was caught early and beaten within an inch of my life. He even wanted to report me to the village. Tai stared at his friend, then poured him more tea, saying, "So, you escaped from jail then?" Dan rubbed his bruised body, which still ached. That old woman in the house pleaded for me. If it weren't for her, I don't know what would have happened. Tai clicked his tongue. Well, consider it a blessing in disguise. Go take a bath, put on some new clothes. I'll slaughter a chicken and we'll feast. Consider it a clean break from your past as a servant. Dan, with blurred vision, still stared fixedly towards his old village. The two men kept drinking and chatting all day until they were too drunk to do anything but pass out. As for Master Keem, after the meeting about reinforcing the dike, he hurriedly went to inspect his family's extensive rice fields. The field workers had already dammed the water, preparing for the dry season harvest and the incoming flood season. The dry stubble and the withering rice stalks under the scorching sun created a distinctive aroma of ripening fields. The vast, endless paddies formed a sprawling golden canvas. The wind gently rustled the rice, almost ripe. In 2 or 3 days, we can have them cut it, Master Keem mumbled to himself, then walked straight to a banyan tree in the middle of the field to avoid the sun. Leaning his staff against a small mound of earth under the banyan's shade, Master Keem unbuttoned his shirt, enjoying the cool breeze. His gaze swept across the golden fields, stretching to the horizon. Master Keem saw a figure approaching. At first, he thought it was a farmer inspecting his fields, just like him. But as the person drew closer, Master Keem realized it wasn't a villager, but a woman about his age, with a gaunt, frail figure dressed in white, walking with an unsteady gait. Master Keem stopped, surprised. The woman bowed in greeting, and he courteously returned the gesture. Only then could Master Keem observe her face more closely. It was a kind face, with age spots and crow's feet, yet still retaining a rare elegance. Her teeth, unlike those of her generation, were not black like soursop seeds, but white like grapefruit seeds. The only thing that made Master Keem uneasy was her eyes. They were incredibly bright, as if they could penetrate the thoughts of others. Because of these eyes, Master Keem couldn't hold her gaze for long and turned away, his hand involuntarily fingering his wooden rosary beads. The woman suddenly initiated conversation. "Greetings, sir. You're a kind-hearted man, aren't you?" "Yes, madam. I came to inspect my fields and stopped here to avoid the sun. It's quite hot today. May I ask where you're from? This is the first time I've seen you." "I'm visiting my daughter, who married into a neighboring village. I just happened to pass by here." "So, you're a villager here, not a traveler, then?" "Yes, I am Keem, a villager. My house is right there," he said, pointing to his tall, prominent house. The woman's eyes followed his gaze, and her expression immediately changed. As if confirming a doubt in her mind, the woman asked, "Is that the house with the paper flower trellis at the gate? The one with several deserted ponds and a pair of stone lions at the entrance?" Master Keem was startled. "Yes, that's it, so you know my house?" The woman's face showed a hint of discomfort. Master Keem, a perceptive man, noticed it quickly. He asked, "Pardon me for asking directly, but why do you look so troubled?" Instead of answering, the woman asked another question. "Is there an old, ailing person in your house who has been sick for a long time?" "Yes, my mother, almost 80 years old, has been severely ill for months, and no medicine seems to help." The woman hesitated for a few seconds, then spoke a sentence that unnerved Master Keem. "On the 3rd, 14th, and 25th, she will be laid to rest." "What do you mean by that?" Master Keem demanded. The woman suddenly flinched and waved her hand. "Oh, forgive me, sir. I just happened to pass by that house and saw how beautiful it was, so I stopped to admire it for a while. It was just idle talk. Please don't take offense. I must go now." With that, the woman hastened away, leaving Master Keem in a state of confusion. Back home, Master Keem recounted his strange encounter and the woman's cryptic words to his wife. Mrs. Ba Keem also grew worried. After a few seconds, she cautiously said, "The words of old, wise people spoken unintentionally often come true. The 3rd and 14th have passed. Today is the 23rd. We only have 2 more days until the 25th, I'm afraid." Mrs. Bakim trailed off, her eyes filled with sorrow as she looked towards the room where her mother-in-law was resting. Master Keem turned to his wife and said, "Whatever happens, my dear, we must prepare for the worst. The ancients taught that one gives birth to children but cannot predict their fate. No one can foresee anything." Mrs. Bakim looked at her husband, her eyes conveying a shared grief deep within her heart, then let out a heavy sigh. Master Keem rose, went to the altar, lit a stick of incense for his ancestors, then returned to the tea table. His heart was heavy with unspoken worries. From that day on, Master Keem set aside all his outside work. He didn't leave the house, staying by his mother's side, never leaving her for a moment. In his heart, he only hoped that the woman's words were nothing but a baseless tale, an unintentional jest. He constantly prayed to his ancestors, begging them not to let misfortune knock on their door. However, as if by luck from that day on, Grandma Nham seemed to regain her lucidity. She could move around the house without needing her daughter-in-law's support. Life flowed peacefully. Yet precisely on the 25th, Grandma Nham suddenly grew weak and found it hard to breathe. After a simple dinner, Grandma Nham complained of fatigue, went to bed, and slowly began to fade. The news of Grandma Nham's impending death spread quickly through the village, terrifying Master Keem and his wife. Almost everyone in the village had benefited from her kindness, so when they heard the news, people rushed to their house. From officials like the village chief to elders and young and old alike, they all came, crowding both inside and outside the house. Some even sat on the ground in the courtyard, their eyes filled with sorrow, gazing into the room, which was now packed with people. On the bed, covered by a crimson blanket, Grandma Nham's eyes were closed, her mouth open, hands placed on her chest, utterly lifeless, like a waiting corpse. Holding his mother's hand, Master Keem's eyes were now swollen with tears. At the thatched house across the village, Dan and Tai, now well-rested and looking neat, prepared some tools, lit more torches, and sharpened their knives, heading back towards the village. The leftover wine and meat from the morning feast were still on the table. Master Keem had chased the traitor Dan from his house. Dan and Tai had plotted to return to his house for a big score, then leave the village for good. As a trusted servant in the house, Dan knew Master Keem's comings and goings well. He knew where Master Keem hid his treasures and even the location of his hidden gold. If they could pull off one successful heist, they would be rich beyond imagination. After meticulously outlining their plan for infiltration and escape that night, the two decided to act. It was already the first hour of the Metal Rat, the third watch, when Dan and Tai stealthily walked along the deserted dike road. The village scenery was immersed in a desolate gray, a crescent moon high above casting a faint light, illuminating the two figures. As they neared the end of the dike road, the sky suddenly changed. The moon disappeared behind layers of black clouds, and the wind began to howl. The two grave robbers quickened their pace. Fierce gusts swept through, carrying broken branches. Dark, twisted clouds seemed to rip open the sky. A heavy storm was brewing, perfect for their plan that night. "Don't worry," Dan mumbled to Tai, unable to hide his excitement. Tai also whispered, "Master Keem's family is one of the richest in this district. If this heist goes well tonight, not only my life, but your life will also change completely. I'll leave this place, go to the Eastern District, buy a house and buffaloes, and marry a few young women. I'll finally get revenge for my resentment and live in comfort for the rest of my life. I'll finally have my head held high." The two men mumbled a few more words, then quickened their pace. When they were still a distance from the village, where Master Keem's house stood, Dan, to be safe, urged Tai to take a shortcut, sneaking in through the backyard. Tai quickly threw his torch into a deserted pond by the road, then followed Dan towards the backyard of the house. But as they were about to climb the wall to infiltrate, both men flinched when they heard the sudden sound of sobbing. Collecting themselves, they listened carefully. Dan quickly guessed what was happening. It's the weeping of Master Keem and his wife, as the old woman has just died. "Tonight, we can't break in." Tai was displeased. "How do you know for sure? And besides, we've come all this way already." Dan mumbled something under his breath, then, frustrated, nodded. The two men crept along the fence to the vacant lot next to the courtyard, listening intently. Dan confirmed his suspicions. "You were right, my friend. She really died right at the first hour of the Metal Rat on the 25th of the lunar calendar." When Dan was still a servant in the house, Grandma Nham had always treated him with kindness, like her own grandchild. But because of his greedy, selfish, and ungrateful nature, hearing the news of the old woman's death only made him feel a perverse sense of satisfaction. After a few more words, the two thieves decided to turn back, as they couldn't act that night. On the way back, Dan suggested to Ty that they use the chaos of the funeral to sneak in and steal the gold. But Ty immediately objected. Right now, the whole village is craving money, so doing something rash-like that will only get us caught and serve as a warning to others. While the two were still plotting, at Master Keem's house, the funeral began. Grandma Nham was loved by many in the village, so a large crowd of guests came to offer condolences. More than 100 tables were set up. Master Keem, as the head of the family, wore a mourning robe of coarse cloth and a white turban, standing with his wife and children to receive the guests. From morning until evening, the stream of guests showed no sign of slowing down. After the funeral rites had been performed for 5 days, as was the village custom, on the evening of the 6th day since Grandma Nham's death, the priest finally allowed the coffin to be moved to the cemetery for burial. While Dan was sound asleep in his house, Ty, unable to give up, went to the funeral. He easily blended into the grieving crowd accompanying Grandma Nham. When the procession reached the cemetery and placed the coffin next to the freshly dug grave, Ty lingered in the distance, observing, trying to pinpoint the location. Being a cunning and seasoned thief, Ty noticed a large tomb made of marble with a tall gravestone nearby. To be safer, he found a tomb not far from the funeral, lit a few sticks of incense, and pretended to pray for a deceased relative. After the Keem family threw handfuls of earth and completed the burial rites, the crowd slowly dispersed. Ty waited until everyone was gone before confidently standing up, looking around. A cruel plan was forming in his mind. Rushing back to the house, Ty woke Dan up with a loud shout. "Get up, Dan, we're about to get rich." "What's wrong? Why the rush?" Dan asked, still groggy. Ty whispered something to Dan for a long time. Dan's eyes suddenly widened, his dark skin turning pale, veins bulging like snakes. Ty shushed him frantically, covering his mouth. "I overheard people saying that the old woman's coffin was buried with a lot of gold and silver. Master Keem is so rich and his mother was virtuous, but he's also a dutiful son. There must be tons of gold and silver buried with her. If you don't believe me, cut off my head. The house is bustling with people right now. If we can't pull off a heist there, why don't we just dig up the grave? Who knows, we might hit the jackpot. It won't be enough, though." After hearing the plan to rob the grave, Dan thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement. That night, after preparing their tools, the two grave robbers, filled with anticipation, headed to the cemetery to dig up the old woman's newly buried grave. As soon as they stepped onto the sacred ground, it began to drizzle. The rain wasn't heavy, but it made the cemetery air feel even more desolate, and the wind howled louder, like the wailing of souls in the underworld. The cold began to seep into Dan and Ty's bones. They shivered, pulling their thin clothes tighter, and checked their tools: a crowbar, 2 hoes, a bottle of white wine, and a bundle of torches. They stealthily approached Grandma Nham's grave. As Ty had observed, during the day, few people visited the cemetery, and at night, with the rain and wind, no one would dare to venture out. An eerie stillness settled over the desolate field, broken only by the occasional distant rumbling of thunder. This made the two feel a little uneasy, but the thought of the gold and the promise of a rich future spurred them on. They passed several small, low-lying tombs. Dan and Ty hurried forward, their hearts pounding with greedy anticipation. The cemetery was inherently low-lying, located in a marshy area compared to the surrounding rice fields. With the rain, the mud began to soften and cling to their bare feet, making each step heavy and difficult. Dan had to stop repeatedly, stepping on gravestones to clear the mud from his feet. After about half an hour, soaked and panting, they finally reached Grandma Nham's grave. Ty quietly exclaimed as he jumped onto the mound of earth. Dan quickly approached, gazing intently at the fresh mound. "Hurry, drop the tools." Ty pulled Dan back and whispered, "I've observed it. The earth here is about half a fathom deep. We'll need at least an hour to dig it up. It's almost 4 in the morning. We need to dig quickly, uncover the coffin swiftly. Today is the 7th day since Master Keem's family buried her. They'll surely come to pray at the tomb early in the morning. If we're not fast, we'll be discovered." Dan nodded in agreement, wiping the mud from his face with the rainwater. "Go get the wreaths off," he said quickly, standing up and pulling the wreaths aside, searching for a place to dig. Meanwhile, Ty quickly spread out the tools, grabbing 2 hoes, one for himself and one for his friend. Just as he was about to turn back to Dan, Ty suddenly froze in terror when he heard a faint, guttural hiss. His face turned ashen. "What was that? Don't make such a frightening sound. You'll make me jump out of my skin," he said, but then he too realized something horrifying. Grandma Nham's grave in that damp, gloomy area was covered with many wreaths. Perhaps some venomous creatures had made their home there. When Dan pulled one wreath aside, he was horrified to see a cobra, as thick as a carrying pole, coiled on the gravestone. The snake raised its head high, its hood spread wide like a hand, hissing menacingly, as if ready to strike the audacious intruders. But with his cunning nature, Ty quickly swung his hoe, hitting the snake's body, slicing it in half. The snake hissed, writhing on the ground, its 2 halves struggling. While Dan was still stunned, Ty quickly delivered another powerful blow, crushing the snake's head into a bloody mess. Holding the dead snake, Ty chuckled. "Well, that's one less obstacle." He threw the snake aside and told Dan, who, still a bit stunned, continued to help his friend remove all the wreaths. In a short while, the mound was bare under the drizzling rain and the occasional thunder. Having located the digging spot, the 2 men put all their strength into it and immediately began working. 2 hoes swung vigorously, one after another, digging up handfuls of earth. Quickly, they held their breath and worked without a sound, as if racing against time. The earlier drizzle had turned into heavy rain, and the wind began to howl fiercely. The mud, mixed with rainwater, clung to their hoes, making their task heavier and more arduous. After about half an hour, both began to dig systematically. Ty jumped directly into the grave, wielding a shovel and a basket, frantically scooping wet mud into the basket, which he then passed up to Dan. Dan quickly dumped the earth to the sides, then passed the empty basket back down, waiting. Their cooperation was swift, so the ever-deepening grave quickly widened. As Ty had calculated, after an hour, the shovel hit something solid, making a dull thud. Ty shouted with delight, throwing the shovel aside, quickly kneeling and feeling the mud, then stood up and called out, "We've hit the coffin. Pass the crowbar down, quickly." On the bank, Dan frantically pulled the heavy crowbar, dropping it to his friend, then jumped down into the grave himself. "What now?" Dan asked, his voice hoarse and excited. Ty quickly wiped the cold rain from his face and said, "We need to dig a little more earth around it. Then we'll try to pry open the lid." Dan quickly complied. In just a few moments, he had dug enough space for both of them to comfortably stand. Gripping the crowbar, Ty gritted his teeth, putting all his strength into prying. The lid was still covered in layers of thick, sticky mud. After a few attempts, the coffin lid revealed a fresh coat of red lacquer and gold leaf, gleaming brightly under the torchlight. Once they had cleared enough space, Ty instructed Dan to find a crack. Dan grunted, gritted his teeth, and plunged the sharp end of the crowbar deep into the crack. But before he could pry it open, he suddenly stopped, horrified, and looked up. Ty also noticed something and stood frozen, mouth agape. For a few seconds, both heard a faint, thud-thud sound like footsteps treading on the mound above. Robbing a grave was a life-or-death matter. One careless mistake could cost them their heads. So, hearing even the slightest footsteps, both froze. Dan, terrified, dropped the crowbar and pulled Ty down, crouching, holding his breath, waiting. But just then, both men breathed a sigh of relief. A black cat with a soaking wet body, its eyes shining in the dark, sat on the mound above them, its face tilted as if observing them. Surprised and scared, the cat let out a piercing shriek, then bolted away, disappearing into the darkness. Dan, emboldened, stood up again and resumed the task of prying open the coffin. Ty gripped one end of the crowbar, gritting his teeth, jaws clenched, trying to pry open the coffin. Grandma Nham's coffin was made of good wood, tightly sealed, so it wouldn't budge after many attempts. "Damn it, they nailed it too tightly," Dan grumbled. Ty approached his friend, and together they exerted all their strength. Dan even lifted his body to add more leverage to the heavy crowbar, now bent slightly like a bamboo stalk. The sound of nails being pulled from the coffin began to creak, one after another, accompanied by harsh grinding noises. "1, 2, 3, Ty commanded in a hoarse whisper. They inserted the crowbar deeper into the crack, then continued to push and pull, the wood groaning and creaking as the nails popped out in succession. With one final, strenuous effort, Teeth gritted, eyes bulging, all the nails broke clean, and the coffin lid sprang open. A putrid smell of a decomposing corpse immediately escaped into the air, thick and nauseating. Instantly, both grave robbers dropped their crowbars and staggered back to avoid the stench. The smell of a human corpse, after several days, was unlike that of any other animal. It was a lingering mix of the sickly, sweet odor of decaying meat, the fetid smell of blood, the sourness of feces and urine, all blended with the fresh scent of wood and the fishy smell of raw mud, creating an utterly repulsive aroma. Despite desperately clamping their noses and mouths shut, both men retched violently, tears streaming from their eyes. Ty, his spirit shaken, whispered, "When this smell fades a bit, we'll get the gold. It's not too late, it's all in the coffin." After vomiting green bile, yellow bile, and even blood, Dan desperately wanted to escape this foul pit. But because they were racing against time, he still held onto his friend's hand and said, "No, don't. The smell will only fade by morning. Ty, if Master Keem's family catches us, they'll tear us limb from limb." The sickening feeling wouldn't stop, but Ty remained clear-headed, agreeing with his friend. He quickly wrapped his shirt around his mouth. Dan then began to put all his strength into lifting the coffin lid. Thunder still rumbled, rain poured down, and lightning still flashed, illuminating the grave. As soon as the lid fell, Dan found himself face to face with the deceased, her face washed pale by the rain, Grandma Nham's features starkly revealed. Dan gasped in horror, recoiling, not wanting to face that terrifying sight. Grandma Nham's coffin had been buried just this morning, but because the earth was wet and the area was low-lying, compounded by the heavy rain, her shroud and clothes were soaked through. Now, after 6 days of funeral rites in the house, Grandma Nham's body had begun to swell, and her flesh had started to decompose. The sickening stench, mixed with rainwater, assaulted the grave robbers' noses, making them vomit twice more, their stomachs churning. Both began to grope for gold. Initially, Dan suggested pulling Grandma Nham's corpse out to make it easier to search, but Ty stopped him, saying the grave was too narrow. Frightened, both men, pale and trembling, reached their hands down into the coffin, searching through the bodily fluids, blood, and fat clinging to their arms. The slippery, greasy sensation made both men feel utterly disgusted. But just as Ty had guessed, beneath the decomposing corpse lay treasures. Handfuls of pure gold were pulled out. 4 heavy ceramic pots were placed at the bottom of the coffin, Ty placing them at different spots, 2 on each side, and 1 large block of gold at Grandma Nham's head. The gold pots were successively brought up, the clinking sound bringing joy to the 2 grave robbers. Once they were sure all the treasures had been retrieved, Ty urged Dan to quickly climb out of the grave. Suddenly, Dan stopped, remembering something. "Wait, this old woman, when she was alive, always wore a jade bracelet. I heard that bracelet was made of imperial jade, worth a fortune. This old woman cherished it like a priceless treasure. The family must have buried it with her when she died. Go up there and get me a sharp knife. Without that bracelet, all this treasure isn't worth much." Ty nodded, climbed out of the grave, and a moment later jumped back down with a small, sharp knife. Taking the knife from his friend, Dan gripped the cold corpse with one hand and swiftly slit the shroud with the other. But whether it was from haste or the sudden deafening thunder, he slipped and tumbled into the coffin, unexpectedly landing on the corpse. The blood and fat from the corpse clung to him. In a panic, struggling to get free, Dan accidentally splashed some of the greasy bodily fluid onto his stomach. Horrified, he screamed, frantically climbing out of the grave pit, using all his strength. He quickly rolled into a nearby puddle in the field, letting the bloody fat wash away. In the grave pit, Ty, consumed by greed, quickly knelt down, tearing at the shroud with his bare hands, groping around. But after searching for a long time, he couldn't find the jade bracelet. Frustrated, he grabbed the edge of the pit. Dan, his entire body soaked in mud, was struggling to get up. Ty urgently called out, "Dan, hurry up and hand me the gold. I can't find the jade bracelet." Dan stumbled closer and weakly agreed, beginning to take each pot of gold that Ty was passing up. After receiving the last pot of gold, Ty put his hands on the edge of the pit, then tried to hoist himself up. But just as he pulled his head out of the grave, a sudden, loud clang of gold rang out. Instantly, Ty shrieked, falling backward, landing heavily inside the coffin. A sharp pain shot from the top of his head, quickly spreading, paralyzing him. From where the pain originated, not a single drop of fresh blood flowed. Ty gurgled, his mouth twisted, terrified, as Dan stood frozen on the bank, a blood-soaked rock in his hand. With a last burst of strength, Ty gasped, You. On the bank, Dan burst out laughing, dropping the rock. He leaned against the tomb, exhausted, a deranged smile on his face. What jade bracelet, you fool? That was just a trick to get me out safely so I could be here waiting for you. I've told you countless times that your greed will be the death of you. You never listened. Well, goodbye. Now that you're dead, no one will know the secret. Don't worry, a year from today, I'll burn plenty of ghost money for you. Right after his chilling laugh, Dan began frantically shoveling earth. The heavy, mud-laden soil, mixed with rainwater, was dumped into the grave pit. Ty, unable to scream, his mouth grotesquely twisted in extreme horror, lay on the corpse, eyes wide open, watching himself being buried alive. Less than an hour later, Grandma Nham's grave was refilled as before. More carefully, Dan even rearranged the wreaths on the grave. Then he gathered his tools, put all the gold pots into a basket, and took a shortcut back to the house on the dike. By then, it was the first hour of the fifth watch. Dan, clutching the basket, carried all the gold, put it into a cloth bag, then untied the red string and disappeared to another land. After hundreds of miles from his old village, Dan finally felt relieved. But being a cunning and sly fox, he continued his journey. He bought a horse and spent another half-month traveling, finally finding a certain district. After introducing himself as a merchant wanting to buy land and buffaloes and become a resident of the village, and with the large sum of money Dan presented as gifts, the district chief agreed to register him as a resident under a completely new name. Live & Co. With his new identity, Dan began to buy land and build a house, a grand, tall house with 5 compartments, a stone wall, and tiled roof, which made everyone envious. After settling down, Dan bought 5 more plots of land and hired 8 servants. He began to live a leisurely life. From the day he registered in this district, he completely abandoned his past gambling and debauched ways, as if shedding his old skin. From a cunning and deceitful person, Dan transformed into a perfectly respectable and prominent master. But good times never last. Exactly 100 days after that grave-robbing night, horrifying events began to seek him out, appearing even before dusk, just as the sun was setting. Having immigrated to this village under a new identity, Live & Co., Dan always presented himself as a considerate man. Coupled with his immense wealth, he had, to some extent, built a reputation in the village. Thus, in village meetings, he was always invited to sit among the elders and officials to discuss and contribute ideas for the village. That afternoon, as dusk approached, the setting sun cast a melancholy, reddish-brown hue over the communal courtyard. It was time for him and the other elders to part ways, each returning home. Alone, leaning on his staff, Dan walked along the dirt road, absent-mindedly looking forward to his rendezvous that night with the singing girl he had just met, who was humming a folk tune in his room. Suddenly, he flinched and stopped dead in his tracks when he heard someone call his name. The voice was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind, yet it echoed deeply within him. Dan! Startled, he quickly turned his head, but there was no one behind him. Only a small dirt road bathed in the fading light of dusk, and 2 rows of silent bamboo trees casting long shadows. Dan composed himself for a moment, then muttered, "There's no one here. Did I just imagine it? How strange." So, he turned and continued his walk home. But as soon as he turned around, he suddenly flinched, seeing a disheveled figure looking exactly like a beggar, with a slightly hunched back and tangled gray hair, dripping wet as if he had just fallen into the river. This beggar was walking in the opposite direction from him. Seeing the beggar, Dan felt a chill run down his spine. The beggar's emaciated body, ragged clothes, clearly showed deep scratch marks. Moreover, the beggar's brown clothes were stained with dark, deep brown patches, like dried blood. But more than that, the beggar gave him a strange feeling, both unfamiliar and familiar. For a fleeting second, Dan felt as if he was facing a tormented spirit, not a living person. Startled, Dan quickly walked past the beggar. At that moment, he felt a powerful, putrid, fishy stench assault him. Dan covered his nose, trying to walk faster to escape the ominous smell. But just as he passed, he shivered, feeling an intense cold, as if a chilling gust of wind swirled around his neck, biting cold like a ghostly hand caressing his body. A shiver ran through him. He turned his head frantically, but still only saw the beggar shuffling heavily along the deserted road. Dan stood staring until the hunched figure disappeared around a bend. Only then did he turn and continue his journey. But after only 2 steps, he grimaced and covered his nose again, looking down. He noticed his new shoes, bought for 3 silver coins, were now covered in a deep pile of fresh feces. Annoyed, he let out a frustrated grunt and walked towards a nearby pond to wash his shoes. But as he neared the edge of the pond, he was once again drawn by a strange sound. A splashing noise, as if someone was swimming in the pond, immediately made him look up. Across the pond stood a dense tree, its branches hanging over the water. At the base of the tree was a small, neglected shrine, its incense long cold and unlit. After a quick glance, he realized the splashing sound was still there, yet the surface of the pond was completely calm, not even the slightest ripple. But then he suddenly gasped in terror, mouth agape, falling backward to the ground. The ghostly figure of the beggar he had just seen was now standing there, tall and imposing, as if it had been there all along. Behind the beggar was another figure, very familiar, but its body was also ragged, standing still and silent like a shadow. The beggar slowly raised a bony hand towards him, waving it. Faced with this scene, a terrifying chill suddenly enveloped Dan's heart. Dan quickly scrambled backward onto the dirt road, then turned and ran straight home without daring to look back. Upon reaching home, he quickly entered, seeing Sen sweeping the courtyard. He hastily took off his shoes, threw them to her, and said, "Sen, brew me some strong tea." Sen dropped her broom, looked up at her master, her face suddenly pale. Dan's eyes, wide with unspoken terror, were very different from his usual calm demeanor. Sen quickly asked, "Master, what's wrong? Why do you look so pale? Did you catch a chill? This season is very unhealthy." Dan mumbled, "What wind or chill? Just brew the tea quickly, don't stand there arguing or you'll die." Sen, startled, mumbled, "Yes, sir," picked up the muddy shoes and hurried to the kitchen. Left alone, Dan rushed to the main house and slumped onto the couch, his mind replaying the terrifying image of the beggar. The melancholy dusk had finally faded, and darkness crept in from the direction of the rice fields in front of the house, covering the trees in an eerie, dim light. After several anxious moments, Dan finally stood up and walked into his room to find his opium pipe. As he stepped through the door of his room, he suddenly gasped in horror when he looked down. In the last faint light of dusk, just behind the threshold, lay the upper half of a cobra's body. This image brought back the memory of the snake that Ty had cut in half on Grandma Nham's grave exactly 100 days ago. While he was still frozen in fear, the snake suddenly coiled, spread its hood, and bit his leg. Dan shrieked in terror, falling backward. At that moment, his 2 servants rushed out, their panicked cries echoing from the kitchen. Sen, the servant girl, rushed to her master, her face pale, and asked, "Master, what's wrong?" Dan grabbed Sen's hand, pulling her to him, his voice trembling. "Help me, Sen, a snake. A venomous snake bit me. Help me, Sen." Sen stared at the wound on her master's leg, confused. "Master, there's no bite mark here. Are you just seeing things?" Dan, terrified, pointed towards his room, gasping, "It's right there by the door of my room." Sen, holding her broom, cautiously approached, looking inside. Dan, pale, stared at his leg, then looked closer. But to his horror, he saw that Sen's words were true. There was no snake bite on his leg. While he was still bewildered and suspicious, Sen turned around, holding out a piece of rope. She showed him the rope and said, "Master, I've searched the whole room. There's no snake, just this piece of rope." "You must have imagined it." Dan, still trembling, said weakly, "Burn that rope, quickly. My heart is pounding like crazy." Sen, confused, nodded and took the rope to the kitchen. A moment later, she returned with a cup of strong tea. After serving her master a bowl, Sen asked permission to go cook dinner. Dan waved her away, then went out to the courtyard, letting out a heavy sigh. The moon had risen and the sky had turned pitch black. The servants had also brought the buffaloes home. After a while, a strange quiet descended over the house. Dan finally stood up and lit a lamp. That night, he felt something very strange, a peculiar uneasiness. He felt as if a shadow was constantly following him. He turned up all the oil lamps as high as they could go. After a while, a lavish feast of wine and meat was laid out. But that night, Dan's mind was preoccupied with other matters, so he only ate a few bites before sending Sen away to clear the table. Dan, disturbed, walked to the front courtyard and sat on a small stool by the miniature rock garden. Sen, mumbling that the food was still almost untouched, cautiously asked, "Master, can we have these leftovers? It would be a waste to throw them away." Dan listlessly waved her away, but then suddenly said, "Tell Lang to lock the gates securely. There are many thieves around these days. It's better to be careful." Sen nodded hesitantly and carried the trays to the side room. As soon as she disappeared behind the house, Dan wearily looked up at the sky, as if expecting something. A moment later, he thought he saw someone standing by the side of the house, staring intently. Convinced it was Sen about to ask something, Dan called out, "Did you tell Lang to close the gates yet? What are you standing there for?" Receiving no reply, Dan was about to turn around and scold Sen when he suddenly realized there was no one there. The side of the house was utterly silent. Only the rustling of the wind from the garden, carrying an eerie chill, swept in. Dan felt uneasy, his forehead clammy, trying to calm himself. But as he happened to glance under the stool, he flinched again, hearing a faint wheezing sound, like someone with a cold, and also a soft sob. Before Dan could collect himself, the terrifying reality fully assaulted his vision. Under the stool was a pale face, a pair of half-closed eyes, and a wide-open mouth slowly exhaling. Dan gasped in horror, falling backward off the stool, frantically looking again. The figure under the stool had vanished, and the faint sobbing had also stopped. Only an empty brick courtyard remained, shrouded in deep darkness. The recent shock left him terrified. He rushed down to the side house and immediately called out to a servant who was eating dinner. "Lang, tonight you come to the main house and stand guard for me." Lang, still scooping rice into his mouth, looked up at his master, confused. The other servants exchanged nervous glances, as Dan had never allowed them into the main house before. Lang chewed, quickly swallowed, then wiped his mouth and mumbled, "Master, should I bring my dinner up now?" "No. No dinner, leave it there and go to the main house. And remember to light a few extra torches, very bright ones." Lang, though puzzled, still obeyed his master. That night, with Lang diligently by his side, Dan felt somewhat safer. Time slowly passed. Inside his room, Dan lay on the bed while Lang slept on a mat on the floor. After a while of chatting, Dan, bored, asked, "Lang, tell me, are there ghosts in this world?" Lang thought for a few seconds, then nodded. "Even an uneducated person like me knows there are ghosts, master. Just as there is light and darkness in heaven and earth, there are people and ghosts. That's what our village scholar always says. But I've only ever heard of ghosts appearing to people, never of them killing anyone." Dan nodded thoughtfully. At this moment, he finally realized that Grandma Nham's ghost was returning to haunt him. If the servant's words were true, perhaps the ghost only appeared to him, not to harm him. Nevertheless, Dan still felt a shiver of dread, and a sense of unease gnawed at his heart. Yet, he still pretended to be brave. "I've never believed in ghosts. I've never met a ghost before." "But if what you say is true, what can one do to ward off evil spirits?" Lang sat up, leaning against the wall, and continued, sounding knowledgeable, "I've heard that ghosts are most afraid of fresh dog blood, garlic, 2 layers of beetle leaves, and children's urine. If a house is haunted, people usually put beetle leaves and garlic under their pillow, or dog's blood and children's urine around the house. They say those things make ghosts flee instantly. I don't know if it's true or not." Dan grunted, then fell into deep thought. That entire night, the 2 masters and servants whispered and talked, and the next morning, both overslept. As soon as he woke up, Dan sent a few servant girls to the market to buy a head of garlic, then had them get him a handful of beetle leaves from the garden, and also bought black dog's blood, which he buried around his property. He hoped these things could ward off the ghost and prevent it from appearing again. Less than a week passed. Just as Lang had said, horrifying events began to seek Dan out again. Dan was trying to resume his normal life, but on the night of the 14th of the 10th lunar month, he encountered the ghost again. This time, the feeling of terror intensified 100-fold. That night, he had brought a courtesan home to sleep. After an intense night of passion, Dan hastily put on some clothes and went out to find water to quench his thirst. After drinking water and smoking some opium, Dan walked into his bedroom. As he pulled back the mosquito net to climb in, he suddenly flinched when he heard 3 urgent knocks at the door. Dan stiffened, sitting silently, listening to confirm if it was truly a knock. The courtesan on the bed was still sound asleep, naked, but after a moment, he heard nothing. Dan was about to pull down the mosquito net when the knocking at the door resumed, 3 more times. Dan hastily got out of bed, walking to the main door, muttering, "Who is it? Why are you knocking so loudly in the middle of the night?" In his heart, he was confident that no one would be out at midnight unless there was an urgent matter. He walked to the wooden door latch and gently opened it. The rusty hinges creaked loudly. Dan stepped closer to the edge, straining his eyes to look out. Of course, there was no one there. The space outside was still thick with mist, dimly lit by a crescent moon partially hidden behind layers of dark clouds. How strange, I clearly heard knocking, Dan mumbled to himself, then bravely stepped out into the courtyard. After waiting for a while, seeing no movement, Dan quickly went to the side house, where the servants ate and lived daily, and called out to the servants who were sleeping on mats on the ground. Hearing their master's voice, they quickly woke up. One immediately asked, "Master, what can we do for you?" With a suspicious tone, Dan asked, "Tonight, did any of you go up to the main house and knock on my door?" The servants, blinking sleepily, looked at each other in confusion, then all replied, "No, master, are you sure? We were all asleep, but even if we were awake, none of us left the side house. We didn't hear anything. Or perhaps you were dreaming, master?" Dan pondered, deep in thought. He had clearly heard the knocking with his own ears, not once but twice. How could he be mistaken? But he still tried to deflect. "I was just asking, have you locked the main gate securely?" The servants nodded earnestly. Dan hurriedly went back to the main house, a growing sense of unease in his heart. He walked quickly to the veranda, still lost in thought, when suddenly he heard a fluttering sound, the beating of wings, coming from the old banyan tree. This drew his attention. He looked intently through the misty air, his breathing shallow. After a moment, he realized that an owl had flown from somewhere and perched on a branch of the old banyan tree in the garden, as if waiting for him. The owl flapped its wings, flew swiftly towards the miniature rock garden near him, and let out 3 extremely piercing screeches. In the dead of night, the owl's mournful cries made his hands and feet go weak. He quickly picked up a rock at his feet, aimed at the owl, and threw it hard. The owl soared up, flapping its wings, flying high above his head, and dropped something writhing onto the ground. Dan approached the object, and immediately, his entire body erupted in goosebumps as he recognized it. The lower half of a cobra's body, still coiled. Remembering the snake on the gravestone when he dug up the grave, Dan felt a jolt of terror and bolted into the house. But as he reached the main door, he suddenly felt a cold shiver run through him. From inside the house, he heard the familiar sound of an opium pipe being tapped, along with a gurgling sound as if someone was pouring tea. Gathering all his courage, he peeked inside. He gasped in horror, seeing a shadowy figure, covered in dark mud, wearing clothes of the same muddy color, sitting hunched over the tea table, staring at him. Dan gasped, inadvertently pushing the large, half-open glass door. The hinges let out a long, grating creak, startling the figure. Its head slowly turned, and facing that figure, Dan's pants became soaking wet. He recognized the face of the person sitting in his house. It was none other than Ty, the man he had bludgeoned to death and buried alive nearly 4 months ago. Ty sat there, shrouded in mist, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at Dan with a resentful gaze. Worms wriggled and crawled from his mouth, dropping onto the beetle leaves on the table. Dan collapsed in terror, but his throat felt constricted, as if someone was choking him, so his scream only came out as a weak, strangled sound. Just then, Ty's ghost vanished, and the white mist dissipated as if it had never been there. The oil lamp, which seemed about to extinguish, suddenly flared brightly. But at that moment, Dan clearly felt drops of water fall onto his forehead. Instinctively, he trembled, reaching up to wipe it, and brought his hand close to his panicked eyes. As soon as he saw it, he wanted to vomit again because the liquid was sticky and smelled putrid, like something rotten. He could only guess, his mind reeling in vague terror. Dan shuddered, craning his neck. In just a second, his face turned pale green, his jaw seemed to drop, as on the wooden beam of the veranda, hanging just a few feet above him, was Grandma Nham's corpse, dangling upside down like a bat. Her face, swollen and upside down, stared at him. From her 2 eye sockets, her pupils bulging out, countless worms crawled, and from her swollen body, patches of skin ripped away, splattering onto his face and mouth. Dan screamed in terror, then fainted, eyes rolling wildly. Cold sweat drenched his undershirt. He woke up, still trembling, huddled in the corner of his bed, gasping, realizing it was just a dream. But the dream was so real that he could still faintly smell the stench lingering in the air, and his room seemed to be plunged into a realm of death. He had screamed so loudly, yet the courtesan still slept soundly under the blanket, as if she hadn't heard anything. Terrified, Dan lunged at her, trying to shake her awake, but his entire body trembled uncontrollably. He grabbed her frantically, trying to find some comfort for his pounding heart. But suddenly he gasped, recoiling his hand, feeling that her body was soft like noodles, rotten like fermented jackfruit, sticky like raw mud, and emitted a putrid, foul stench. Terrified, Dan violently pushed the body away, then curled up, covering his head with both hands. A hollow, echoing laugh resounded in the dark night, accompanied by a mournful cry that filled the air, and amidst it, a heavy cracking sound. An owl's eerie shriek echoed outside. Dan came to his senses twice, finding himself still in bed, with the courtesan still clutching him, her body naked. Dan breathed heavily, his face pale after the terrifying nightmare. He hastily threw on his shirt and rushed out to the veranda, unable to hide his terror. The owl's persistent hooting seemed to intentionally mock him. But before he could recover, he suddenly gasped in horror, hearing cracking sounds. These sounds were faint at first, then gradually grew louder, and he realized with dread that they were the sounds of nails breaking, just like when Ty used the crowbar to pry open the coffin. While he stood there, mouth agape with fear, two figures emerged from the mist. Two shadowy figures, sometimes distinct, sometimes blurry, both disheveled, with pale, greenish skin. They were none other than Grandma Nham and Ty. In an instant, the mist seemed to envelop Dan's body. As if by an unseen force, his leg was violently pulled back. In a flash, the mist dissipated, disappearing in just 10 breaths, leaving Dan as nothing but a lifeless corpse, his neck twisted, face contorted, eyes wide and staring blankly, as if his soul had left him. In his mouth was a mouthful of brown mud, the very mud found only in the village cemetery, where Grandma Nham's large brick tomb was built.